I don't know how many amongst us, either in this room or on the Zoom, know about the differences of theology and history of our two joint traditions. I will not go too deep into the history, which some amongst you may appreciate, since I once thought I would be a history professor. But this is not that, is it? A short way of stating the central question and answer at the core of universalism comes from the earliest days of the development of the newly forming church that became Christianity. Before there was central church or churches, or orthodoxy or heterodoxy, there were so many questions being explored, and different writers and thinkers had different answers. Some basic ideas about the nature of God, as they understood that idea, were formed. And among the big questions is what happened after people died. If the answer was you went to heaven or not, then you got new questions. How did God make that choice? No human could be perfectly good. So how good did you need to be before God decided you made it to heaven and that God was looking out for you? How bad did you have to be before God decided it was punishment for you? And then for many now, it was for them that God was seen as a father figure. And yes, it was definitely not a parent figure back then. At one point in its history, this congregation was once called the Church of the Divine Paternity, because it was about that fatherness of God. In those long ago times, the idea of father would be very different from how most of us think or experience father. In the ancient world, and in some places in our current world, the father is the central decision maker and creates the order of the household. So punishment after death was a central concern as the penalty for not following the order of God's house in this life. And some thinkers thought about the human capacity to do bad things and looked at the punishment and said, this can't be. I say thinkers, as there were undoubtedly those who did not write or whose writings were not preserved. One of the writers whose works we have that has a kernel of this thought is Origen. But I'll just return to the questions. For whether the answer was heaven or punishment, it was thought this was going to be it for eternity. And then came the question, how can a person be punished forever for anything a human can do? After all of us are finite. We will live a certain time. We can only do so much. Even the very worst of us can only do so much. And how can any punishment that is infinite be just? And when those thinkers thought about the nature of God, they also believed that God had a loving concern for us, that God loved us. And again, this is them thinking about this God. So how could a loving God punish people for all of eternity? And some thought, no, that is not possible. That is not love. There must be a way that everyone is restored to connection with God. A loving God would never hurt people that much. All people would be connected to God after death at some point, or God could not be loving. Of all of the theological imaginings of God, these thinkers chose love as the most important attribute, not the power, not the presence, not the knowledge, but the love. And with that thought, universalist theology began. Over the centuries since then, it has grown and changed, but that was the core thought. It was not a formed church for most of its history because universalism has been considered a heresy for most of Christian church history. In fact, it's not until the founding of America here that the first congregations of Universalists could form. There were some limited Unitarian congregations in Europe. Unitarianism was also thought and considered highly heretical, but there were a few places where churches were allowed to form. But of all the Universalist histories I've read, the first congregations were formed here. And they were all built around this idea of a God whose focus was love. One of the colloquialisms for this is a God who is too loving to damn us. I know, but that was the way they thought. And in fact, this congregation, in its founding in 1838, was called the Friends of the Final Restitution. And that restitution is the reconciliation, the connection of everyone through love. At some point, there was never any hope of you being left behind. And in that same period here in America, there were being arguments about how to read these Christian scriptures, as Christianity was, as it is now, the predominant public religion. And it was thought to hold the guidance about how we, even in a democracy, should govern ourselves. We hear some people who still want to do it that way now. The Bible was seen as a moral code that could be a blueprint for human society. And mind you, there were, and always have been, non-Christians here in America. But even in a democracy, that has rarely stopped this line of thought. And one of the biggest differences is how people in America thought our society was ordered was around slavery. Contrary to what we are often told, it is not that the churches were neutral and silent on the topic, although some were. It is that some of them preached actively, using their reading of the Bible to advocate for slavery and its spread. They read the stories in the Bible about slaves and slavery and took that as evidence that slavery was inherent in how God planned the order of the world. By their reasoning, slavery was necessary for a godly society. They would point to story after story about slaves or writings about slaves in the Christian scriptures and said, see, it's all part of God's plan, and you can't argue with the Bible. And those who wished to abolish slavery, the abolitionists, also felt the need to build their case using those same Christian scriptures. Most of those who read the Bible treated the whole text as it was a unified whole telling one connected story with the same idea about God all the way through. If any of you have read the Bible, or even some good-sized pieces of that, you know that's not actually true. But this is the claim that has been made throughout most of Christian church history and is made in many churches even today. You just got to read it right, and you can see it all hangs together, and we'll tell you how to read it. You'll hear that in lots of churches. But our Universalist forefathers and foremothers, among others, were those who looked at that Bible and looked at those arguments for slavery, and they used the same argument that we use today to argue about other types of oppression and injustice. Because I'm telling this history not to highlight our past, but to highlight our present. For this same struggle is happening now. So I wanted to look back at our Universalist ancestors to remind us of their answer. For those abolitionists, some Universalists, and some from other churches made a move that was a seismic shift. They looked at this text and they found places, some in the Hebrew scriptures and some in the Christian writings, where God said in short, love me and love others as yourself. Some texts went further and said one must love one's enemies. But the important thing is that there were these texts that said love was the most important thing to God. And they then said, our guide for justice and truth must be love. Slavery cannot be God's plan because it causes horrible suffering, and that is not love. And they went out and proclaimed that truth, that which is against love cannot be from God, and it is unjust, and it must be stopped. And they spoke and they gave speeches and they preached this new truth, that God and love were the source of true justice. And all else in the Bible should be ignored if it failed this test of love. They had found their center point. They had found their lodestone. So it is not that they chose love as an either or a this or that. It was choosing love as the central truth. It was the one that would point them to all other truths. For them, it was the most important attribute for God. We can say as Unitarian Universalists today that love is the central key to what presents the core of human ethics and morals and anything that any of us might consider holy. It is a key truth. It is that central guiding point. In some ways, a compass is a wonderful image. If you have lost your way, if you do not know where to turn, follow the point until you are facing love. And that is your way forward. And it is our way forward. And we must wish and work to once again make this society one that can see and follow that shared vision. For we in our society, and in fact, sometimes the whole world, seems to have chosen power and strength as the most important truth. Might makes right, and if we can make you do it, it's right. But that's not it, is it? That's injustice. And those of us who have chosen and continue to choose to follow love must show them our truth. We must work with anyone who is choosing love and human connection and care for one another. We must build connections and work with allies. We must be allies for those who need us. For what these times need is that each of us, and so many more, because we could never do this, no one person, no one group of person, no city full of people can do this. It must be so many of us joined together, showing them this choice, offering the choice, and showing them what it looks like when you choose love. And we must follow that choice wherever it leads, again and again and again. So may it be.